I mean, my dad died in last year,
Yeah.
and my mum died a few years before that. And some people may know this. I mean, I talked a lot about my dad's dementia, which is a type of slow death. And I've talked after my mother died. I did a show in the West End, which was about both of them. It was about my father's dementia, but also my mother, who during her life had a massive affair with a golfing memorabilia salesman and turned our lives over to golf as a result. And the reason I did that, apart from the fact that it was funny, is that at her funeral, I noticed all these people coming up to me and saying, "Oh, your mother was wonderful. She was a wonderful woman. She's wonderful." And what I thought was, that really doesn't say anything about her at all, does it? That really doesn't bring my mother back to life. My mother died very suddenly. It was really kind of shocking and traumatic how she died. And what I wanted, I think, at that point emotionally was sort of some persistence, some actual kind of persistence of her in my life. And the way to do that, I discovered, was to be very, very specific about who she was. And that involves, of course, and it will involve for anyone, being a flawed person and a crazy person and an idiosyncratic person, not a wonderful person. I think what I said in the show is the dead, despite what we might like to think, are not angels. And if you consider them angels, it's kind of a second erasure of them, because your memory of them cannot sustain them just being wonderful people, because no human is a straightforward, wonderful person. And so when I did the show, my brother, who was actually very worried about me doing the show, the first night I said in a Q&A afterwards, I said, "Sorry, I'm not going to take any questions until I hear what my brother thinks." And he said, "I loved it. I loved it because it felt like she was in the room." And I felt, well, then I have achieved what I set out to achieve, which is to sort of bring this woman back to life. But to do that, I have to tell the truth.
Right. And be honest about the dead, which I think is that when we talk about grieving, and I think that there is, grieving, I thought about this in the context of your book too, about like, so if you're concerned about grieving before God, or what God is playing and how you talk about this person, that it is, I think if we're honest about both our emotions and feelings after someone dies, that means being very open and honest about the complications and complicated of the individual who's died. And that is, I think, the move to try and not be that way, I think, is dishonest and can cause even more problems for people potentially if they go on. And that there's been a whole genre of writing about being more honest in obituaries, for example, about what a person was like. And I think it's a different book too,
Yeah, I think with obituaries, maybe. I actually think that it's sort of like being able to joke about one's own ethnic background if you're from that ethnic background. What I felt with that show is, who's going to tell me that I can't make these jokes or tell these stories about my mother? And for me, that's part, I have the license to do that because I am my mother's son, but also, my project is to remember her in a truthful way. If you come back to the God Desire, if you ask me what my motivating principle was in writing this book, in doing that show, it's truth. I'm obsessed with only one thing in my life, and that is truth. And obviously we all have different ways of getting at truth. And at the present time, and this is partly what the book says, is truth is becoming more and more relative. Like the idea of objective truth is more and more suspect. And the internet has done that. And I am interested in whether there are objective truths and whether how you can express those. And one of those was, this is actually what my mother was like. She wasn't a wonderful person, which is not true. That doesn't mean I didn't love her. But wonderful is not what she was in any kind of obvious way. And similarly, I personally think it is an objective truth that God doesn't exist. Now, from that position, I'm happy to say I deeply want him to exist. I deeply understand why people need him to exist, but I believe it to be an objective truth that that creature does not exist.